Alright, this is Bearded D20 here to go over how West Marches works and how I've adapted West Marches for the DC20 West Marches Discord that I'm running. So let's get into it. What is West Marches? West Marches is a style of gameplay in which GMs are encouraged to make not an entire map, but you make you make a couple maps beforehand, so you have some prep done. But you don't really force players to go any specific location. You have your hub, and then you just have interesting things in different directions. Like maybe there's a cool forest over in one place. Maybe there's a ruined castle in another direction. Maybe up here there's some hills that are unexplored. Maybe down south there's a lake with a very very tall mountain that's beginnings of a mountain range. And you just let people go wherever. And as they explore, they will unlock quests in these places, and then you catalog them all inside the hub, and you sort of let people decide what they want to go and do. So if the first people that explore the ruined castle discover that, oh, there's like a really powerful Death Knight who lives in the basement, but we didn't even try to fight him because you know, we figured we had a cleric in our party, and the cleric was able to sense the power rippling off of this creature, and we knew that engaging with it would be almost certain death. So we went and explored the upper floors of the ruined castle and left the basement alone. Well, then that quest goes into the town, and maybe after a couple weeks, people get some items and some experience, and they decide, hey, we'll organize a party and we'll go take down that Death Knight. All right, why West Marches? Well, this goes hand in hand with DC20. So, with DC20 being an alpha, which is created by the Dungeon Coach, you should go check him out if you somehow found this video before all of his content. DC20 is basically a whole bunch of house rules and homebrew for 5th edition that has been converted into its own standalone system. Kind of the main, there's a couple things I like about DC20. I think one of the biggest things, though, is it's very flat. So it lends itself well to West Marches, and I'll explain why in a second. But the flatness of the game means that your characters, although they feel more powerful when they gain experience and level up, they don't feel like they're not mortals anymore. If you think about the fact that your HP pretty much doubles from level 1 to level 2, what exactly does that mean? What does your HP doubling represent? Does that mean I can get stabbed with a sword twice? If you think about it, in reality, what does your vitality doubling mean? It's kind of almost impossible to visualize because even the toughest, strongest people on the planet, if they get run through with a sword, they're probably going to die. Even if the sword itself doesn't kill them, they're going to bleed out. And in DC20, I think represents this the best, while still keeping it as a fun game. And the way that they do that is once you calculate your starting HP, it doesn't really go up unless you're a martial character. And if you're a caster, it doesn't really go up unless you increase your stats. But you start with enough hit points to actually play the game and take some hits, which is nice because we wouldn't want this to be a perfect simulation of reality where the wizard gets stabbed by a goblin dagger, and then the wound gets infected, and then it spreads, and then he's gangrene, and then his arm falls off. We don't. That's not really. There is a style of game where that type of stuff is fun, but I don't feel like that's not what heroic fantasy is trying to capture. And DC20 is definitely a heroic fantasy game. So why West Marches? So when I first learned of DC20, I knew that I wanted to play it, and I was thinking about what the best way to do that was. And so I found Dungeon Coach's Discord, went to his Looking for Group channel, and just kind of on a whim posted, hey, who wants to play some DC20 West Marches? And then I began converting one of my Discord servers that wasn't really used into a West Marches, something suitable for West Marches. And a lot of people joined, a lot more than I thought, a lot faster than I thought. And there's a couple reasons. You could say that West Marches is an iconic phrase. You know, some people who know what this typically means and know that they like this style of play, they're going to be attracted to it. It also is a little bit more flavor than just saying who wants to play DC20, because there were a lot of posts in the LFG channel of people saying like, hey, I want to play. But it didn't really seem like there was much coordination going on to actually get a game going. The other thing with West Marches is since it lends itself to episodic Saturday morning cartoon type sessions where your party members leave the town, they go out and they do something, and then they come back. It's always assumed that everyone who's alive makes it back to the hub location at the end of the session. That basically allows us to run a whole bunch of one-shots that are all linked together through this semblance of being in this hub town. And the different biomes that surround the hub town allow you to try out a bunch of different enemy types. That way you're not stuck fighting nothing but undead, you're not stuck fighting nothing but goblins or orcs, and you don't have to start a new campaign or kind of break your story to add in a new enemy type if you're playing kind of a more mono enemy narrative. Also, West Marches historically has a very large player count, and kind of what I was talking about before, how as players explore the different biomes, then quests get posted. Well, the idea is that players actually request to go on a specific quest for the GM. And the way that works is I typically run games on the weekend, so people kind of know what time I usually run stuff. If nobody requests a specific thing from me, then I just run a generic exploration game. And the people who sign up, they can kind of decide in-game where they're going to go or what they're going to do, or they could talk about it in a thread for the quest in the Discord beforehand. But even if they don't, I have ways to drive them to go and do something. And that brings us to exploration. So the whole purpose of playing, I think, is kind of fueled behind exploration, because people know about these locations, but they don't know what's in them or anything else besides that. And the way that the exploration works, we get to our zone area POI, is all tied in with exploration. So this is all one topic. So zones is an overarching theme. You know, Bastion's the hub city in my West Marches, and it's named Bastion to invoke the image of a fortress, because it is very much a fortress city at the edge of civilization. Not only does it serve as a bulwark, kind of preventing whatever hordes are out here from running past it into the heartland, it also serves as a forward exploration outpost for adventurers to come and dig up the ruins and find artifacts and new resources to fuel the various factions that live here. And so a zone is supposed to be simple, and it should have a name that sort of evokes a particular emotion of what you want people to feel when they think about it. You could just have the forest, and people would generally know what that means, but for my game, I did the Dark Woods, because I wanted people to think of the Dark Woods as not a safe place. And inside a zone, you have areas, and areas are where you get to kind of spice things up a little bit and differentiate it from the inside. And so an area, so the first place that people go to when they go to the Dark Woods is Dawn of the Dark Woods. And this is kind of a lighter forested area. It's not quite as dark as other places that are in here, but it's still not a safe place. You don't want to spend a ton of time out here. There are cloud wolves and marsh bears, and goblins and gnolls that live here that don't really want anything to do with you being in their turf. You go a little bit further in, and you get to Bear Snarl Swamp. And that's the purpose of splitting zones and areas up. So you have a swamp within the forest. What other areas could you have? You could have a lake. It's logical for a forest. You could, I guess, have an entire smaller town as its own separate thing in here. I would probably make this a point of interest instead of an entire area, but you could definitely have an area just be a small town with only a couple of points of interest in it, or like a little village. You could also have features like maybe there's a river that runs through different areas. That could also be an interesting idea. And I feel like if you're going to bother to put a river in your zone, then you should make it navigable via boat. I think that'd be a nice little thing for people to stumble into. And then finally we get to points of interest. And these are the actual locations, these are the battle maps, these are the theater of mind zones, theater of mind locations that people typically play TTRPGs in. You nest these inside the area. And these are your dungeons, your boss maps, your bandit camps, your forgotten tombs. These are all points of interest. Generally put 2 to 3 of these inside of every single area. And that way you make your zone feel pretty big. Now, navigating between all this stuff, we get to random encounters and travel. So, anytime somebody leaves Bastion for the Dark Woods, they need to make a random encounter check. And the way I do my random encounters is I have 1 through 10 be a zone-wide roll, and then 11 through 20 is an area roll. And what this means is 1 through 10, I have a 1 through 10 list of things that can happen that's shared for every single area in the zone. And then if they roll 11 through 20, then it's a zone-specific random encounter. And I think this does 2 things. People that travel there a lot, when they get a 1 through 10, it'll feel familiar. It'll feel like the Dark Woods. But then when they get an 11 through 20, then it will feel it'll remind them that they're not just in the Dark Woods, they're in Barrow-Snarl Swamp. Because they got a Barrow-Snarl Swamp roll. Now, of course, you can structure your random encounters however you want, but I think this creates a feeling of familiarity and uniqueness at the same time over repetitive trips to the same place. And then anytime you travel from point of interest to point of interest inside of an area, I also do another random encounter roll. And then anytime you transit from area to area, I do another random encounter roll. And there is a reason why there are so many rolls. But we will get to that with mounts and rewards and how these funnel, these affect random encounters, and these also affect exploration. They're all intertwined for a reason. Alright, so we'll get to bosses. These are, standalone maps with a single big bad, and that's it. These are the lowest prep of lowest prep. The most prep is just making the boss itself, and then maybe making the map. And make it a point of interest, and you're good. And just leave it. Dungeons. I would assume most people watching this know what dungeons are, but that's a whole topic unto itself. But dungeons are where you want to put, I think, the majority of your focus. But you don't want to make too many of them. You want to make big dungeons that are not cleared in a single session, and put them into make them points of interest inside areas. And it might take a while for people to stumble into them, but that's okay, because once you find them, people are going to go in there and realize how big it is and be like, oh shit, there's a bunch of stuff in here. They're going to come back. And then we get to rewards. So rewards in West Marches is 100 XP per hour and 1 TP. So since DC20 doesn't have a real economy yet because it's still an alpha and there's no real experience rules, I am using Pathfinder 2, which is 1,000 experience to level up, and then you reset to 0. And so this model makes sure that everybody gets at least a little bit wealthier. And the XP makes sure that, after 3 sessions or 2 sessions or 4 sessions, you're leveling up. And that's, I think, a pretty good rate. If you're playing once a week, then you're going to level up pretty quick. But if you're only able to play, twice a month or once a month, it might take you a month or 2 before you hit the next level. And since this is primarily created as one giant continuous playtest, there are people who've played a lot who have level 3 characters already, and they're making new level 1s to try out new things. And so having this low, well, some people think that this is slow because they're used to just leveling up automatically to level 2 after the first session, but I feel like that's a modern incarnation because a lot of people like to tell stories with their games, and level 1 characters are just too squishy in D&D. And they're not in DC20. You start with the majority of your hit points that you're going to have ever at level 1, and so you don't need to level 2 that quick. So the TP stands for treasure parcel, and this represents a sizable amount of money, and there isn't a ton of things you can spend it on, but the items that I've made are important. So the first thing is the Adventures Pack. This is ripped out of Dungeon World. It has 6 charges, unlike the Dungeon World one I think only has 5. But this allows you to pull out miscellaneous adventuring gear. You want a torch, one charge of your AP. You want a can of oil, 1 charge of your AP. You want a box of chalk, you want some flint and steel, whatever you want. You want a rope, you want a grappling hook, you want a lantern, anything that's mundane equipment that would make sense for somebody to have in this situation. 1 charge of your pack, and you pull it out. And then I think I made it 2 charges for weapons, 3 charges for armor, and then 2 charges for kits. So if you want a medical kit, 2 charges. You want a trapping kit, 2 charges. The medical kit's an actual item in DC20. The trapping kit is something that I made so that people can trap monsters, and if you spend a charge from your trap kit, then it's just assumed that you're able to transport a captured creature back to Bastion safely. And that actually came up really quick. People captured cloud wolves, which are an animal, in the Dark Woods, and the cloud wolves became unlocked as a mount that people can buy for small size characters. But anyways, let's continue with the things you can buy for 1 TP. You can buy stuff from the Alchemist. You can buy level 1 healing potions. You can buy Alchemist Fire, or you can buy Unholy Resistance potions. And as characters turn in more exotic material to different factions, in this case specifically the Alchemist Guild and Bastion, they'll unlock more things that they can buy. And I'm really just pulling from Pathfinder 2 and D&D 3.5 for alchemic item ideas, and then just converting the rules over to DC20. And then the last thing that they can buy is a mount. And so we'll come back to random items, because you can buy a roll on the magic item table with 1 TP, but we'll come back to magic items. So mounts, by default, they're just horses. And what mounts allow you to do in this game is bypass random encounters. So every mount, once per session, can be used to scout ahead. So the way this works, say you have a party of 4 people, all 4 people have a mount, so you can bypass up to 4 random encounters in that session. So you're leaving Bastion for the Dark Woods. These random encounters, maybe you've already seen them. You don't want to deal with any of this stuff. So I make the roll. First person uses their mount charge and scouts ahead and sees what the encounter is. They see like a bunch of goblins fighting cloud wolves, and they're like, no, we don't have time for this. We're going to Barrow Snarl Swamp. We got business to do there. So they skip it. They get into the Dawn of the Dark Woods. And maybe they want to explore a little bit first. So they explore. The way I do exploration inside of an area, people can make a survival check, usually DC 10. And then if there's any points of interest that haven't been explored yet, if they make the DC, that'll kind of describe a path to that location. And you don't want to just say you see a goblin camp or you see a cave, although you can. You want to sort of foreshadow the path. Maybe on the way to the goblin camp, there's pikes with cloud wolf skulls, and maybe 2 trees kind of hang close to each other, and there's a marsh bear's head kind of mounted as like a grotesque wreath. And that you can sort of infer that pathway with all these bloody decorations leads somewhere pretty violent, and that would be the path to the goblin camp. And in the case of a cave, you could say, hey, there's a cave behind you, but it's kind of up on this hill, and you're going to have to spend some time climbing. You might need to spend you can spend a charge of your adventurer's pack to produce some climbing tools, or maybe a grappling hook, and just get up there. or you guys can make athletics checks and try to climb. That's kind of GM discretion at that point. How in depth you want to get into that. So we go back to the mount. We're in Dawn of the Dark Woods. We've made that navigation check. We head to the goblin camp, and we have to make another random encounter because we're inside an area, but we are not at a point of interest, but we're going to a point of interest, so we need to make a random encounter check. So the second person uses their mount charge to bypass it. We roll on the table. We see what we get. They don't want to interface with it. They arrive at the outskirts of the goblin camp, and they decide we're not interested in fighting this right now, but we know where it is now. It's marked on the map. We'll tell everyone else in Bastion so they can just come straight here if they want to next time. Well, now it's time to go area to area, so you make another random encounter check, and this will be on the table for the place that you're traveling to. Third person spends their mount charge to bypass a random encounter. And now we have only a fourth person left with one charge. And they can spend that to bypass the encounter for exploring Barrow-Snarl Swamp to find new locations. And this is why there are so many random encounter checks. It is to create a cycle of value and, admittedly, a bit of a money sink. So without random encounters, the world would just feel flat and dead. But having tons of random encounters bogs the campaign down into a bunch of pointless fights, which get old after a while. And this is why I think using mounts in this way with charges to be able to bypass or at least see what the encounter is before you run into it, because not all encounters are bad. Some of them are beneficial, and those are the ones you're like, okay, let's take this one. And this creates a dilemma for players, because even though there isn't a ton of things to spend TP on, this still represents their earnings, their like profit, if you will, for a session. They have to decide, do I want some consumables, some health potions, or maybe 2 health potions and an alchemist fire? That's what I recommend. Because those alchemist fires, even though they only do 1 damage, they cause splash damage, and if you don't have any other area of effect capability on you, this is a way everybody can have a little bit of elemental damage and some area of effect damage, which can be particularly useful against swarms. And if you're a Pathfinder 2 player, you know what swarms are and how annoying they can be if all you have is an axe. The Adventurers Pack, we've decided you're starting with one of those now. But eventually you're going to need to buy a new one once your charges run out. And then you also have magic items and mounts, all vying for your precious 1 treasure parcel attention. And there are different types of mounts. GMs can change what terrain in an area is and make subtypes, so certain mounts don't work there. By default, mounts are terrestrial, but you could also have aquatic mounts, you could have flying mounts. And the idea is, it's like Dawn of the Dark Woods is a terrestrial environment, so your horses, your cloud wolves work there. Barrow-Snarl Swamp is a terrestrial swamp area. So what this means is terrestrial mounts can go into Barrow-Snarl Swamp, but they can't use their scouting ability because the swamp bogs them down. So you can bring your horse, your cloud wolf, in there, but they move so slowly that they don't make an effective scouting tool. And this is where the Marsh Bear comes in. The boss fight that was fought in Barrow-Snarl Swamp a couple weeks ago, the party managed to capture the boss, which was a possessed Marsh Bear, which made it a Dread Bear. And it was in the process of kind of purifying the evil that was possessing it, they were able to kind of use the knowledge of the marsh bear, studying it up close, to be able to go out and, NPC adventurers go out and capture marsh bears and are bringing them back to Bastion, and the players can buy those for 2 treasure parcels because the marsh bears are large. So large-sized creatures can use them as a mount, which is nice. And the marsh bears can go in the swamp because they have that terrestrial swamp movement. There are other GMs that have their own zones, and I know one of them is an oceanic zone, and I would assume at some point that players will be able to buy aquatic mounts through them, and those mounts will only be useful in that person's location. And now we'll circle back to random magic item tables. I'm a big fan of Diablo 2 style loot pinatas. And, well, that would make this game wildly imbalanced if we had magic items pouring out of every single creature, 20 at a time. One of the reasons I play RPGs is for item progression, not just character progression. And I think it's fun to get magic items, even if it's not the most useful thing in the world. It's just cool to get something that you can't just go and buy off the shelf. And so what I've done is created a 1 through 20 roll, which determines the type of item that you get: sword, armor, helmet, cloak. If you roll sword, you can determine what specific type of sword it is, because there's just too many subtypes. The item table just gets too long if I try to include every single one. And I think that also goes a little bit too far into the unfun category, because if you're trying to get a specific type of sword, it can be really frustrating if you get a great sword and then you're just stuck with this great sword that you don't want. The same thing can be said of the table as a whole. If you want a bow and you roll a crossbow or you roll an axe, that can be frustrating, but there's still a better chance you still have a 5% chance of getting the category that you want on a d20 roll. Whereas if I were to make tables that had every possible item type, it'd be way less than 5%. To the point where I think it would just become frustrating. And then there's a material roll. And the highest percent chance is just steel, and that just represents common, normal crafting means. Slightly less common is +1 steel, and that's just your typical +1 modifier. And then rare still, you have cold iron and silver, which I've taken from, I know they're in other editions, but I'm kind of using the Pathfinder 2 idea about what they're good for. And then super rare is Chaos Stone, which is a unique material that is available during the Skitterbin invasion of Bastion. The Skitterbin are just basically Skaven from Warhammer. And then you have a prefix and a suffix, which is the Diablo 2 style method of naming things. And so you can, when you're rolling on the table, you can get some fun weapons like, let's see here. Looking on the weapon prefix table, you have morphing, flaming, icy, electrified, toxic, and returning. On the suffix table, you have lesser Skitterbin Bane, lesser Animal Bane, Firebolt, Ice Bolt, and Lightning Bolt. And those last 3 are cantrips from DC 20. So if you get let's say you get a flaming sword of Firebolt, then you'd have that flaming property, which has a custom rule that's not found in DC 20, but it's an effect that I came up with, and it's not just adding fire damage. It's a little bit more interesting than that. So you could decide what exact type of sword it is. So if you want a short sword, you could be like, nah, it's going to be a flaming short sword of Firebolt. and that Firebolt suffix gives you the cantrip of Firebolt. So I think it'd be kind of fun if you're playing a fighter and you have this flaming sword that can shoot firebolts out of it. It's a cantrip. It's not game breaking. People are welcome to tell me in the comments that it is, but I don't see how. And that pretty much wraps up this initial explanation of West Marches. I can go into some of these categories a bit more. I guess just let me know in the comments what questions or what aspects of this you want me to drill down into a bit more next time. Thanks.